You are living someone else's life. Not dramatically, not obviously, but quietly, consistently, in the thousand small decisions you make without thinking. You wear the mask so well you've forgotten it's there. You've become fluent in a language that isn't yours, performing a script written by expectations you never agreed to follow. And the cost of this? It isn't failure. It's something far more insidious. It's the slow erosion of everything that makes you, you. In the next 18 minutes, you will discover why not knowing yourself is the most expensive mistake you will ever make, and how the ancient art of self-knowledge can transform not just how you think, but how you live, love, work, and find peace in a world designed to keep you distracted from your own soul. The Stoics understood something we have forgotten. They knew that the unexamined life, as Socrates warned, is not worth living. Not because it's morally inferior, but because it's barely lived at all. When you don't know yourself, you become a passenger in your own existence, reacting instead of responding, surviving instead of living, filling time instead of creating meaning. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world, wrote in his private journals, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." But he also knew this: most people never make that journey. They die strangers to themselves. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You think you know yourself. You believe you understand your desires, your values, your limits, your strengths. But answer this honestly. How many of your opinions are truly yours? How many of your goals were chosen freely, not inherited from parents, absorbed from culture, or copied from people you wanted to impress? How many of your fears are real, and how many are merely the echoes of voices you've internalized without consent? Not knowing yourself doesn't feel like ignorance. It feels like normalcy. It feels like going to a job that pays well but drains your spirit. It feels like relationships where you're loved for who you pretend to be, not who you are. It feels like success that leaves you empty, recognition that feels hollow, achievements that you celebrate with a smile while something inside you whispers, "Is this it?" The ancient Greek aphorism, "Know thyself," was inscribed at the Temple of Delphi not as a suggestion, but as a warning. Because the gods knew what we keep forgetting. Ignorance of the self is the root of all suffering. When you don't know who you are, you chase the wrong things. You fear the wrong outcomes. You build a life that looks impressive from the outside but feels like a prison from within. Epictetus, who was born a slave and became one of history's greatest philosophers, taught that we suffer not from events, but from our judgments about events. But here's the deeper layer. Those judgments are not random. They are the product of a self you may not understand. Your anger is not just anger. It's a signal pointing to a violated value you might not even know you hold. Your anxiety is not just anxiety. It's the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be, a nervous system in constant conflict with itself. Consider this. Every time you say yes when you mean no, you betray yourself. Every time you laugh at something that isn't funny, you abandon yourself. Every time you stay silent when you should speak, or speak when you should be silent, you widen the chasm between your inner truth and your outer performance. And the cost accumulates silently, like interest on a debt you didn't know you were borrowing. Modern life is designed to keep you distracted from this work. The noise, the notifications, the endless scroll, the productivity culture, the self-improvement industrial complex that tells you to optimize, hustle, grind, without ever asking the fundamental question. Optimize toward what? If you don't know yourself, all your efficiency is just getting you faster to the wrong destination. You become, as Thoreau observed, someone who has learned to multiply means while forgetting aims. But here's the shift. What if the pain you're avoiding is exactly the doorway you need? The Stoics practiced something they called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, not to be pessimistic, but to strip away the illusions that keep you fragile. They knew that comfort is the enemy of self-knowledge. When everything is easy, you never discover what you're made of. When you're never uncomfortable, you never learn your true boundaries, your actual capacity, your real values. Think of it this way. A person who has never been tested doesn't know themselves. They know only their theories about themselves. Their courage is hypothetical. Their integrity is untested. Their compassion is performative. But when pressure comes, when loss strikes, When failure humbles them, they meet themselves for the first time. And often, they discover they are not who they thought they were at all. This is why Seneca wrote, "Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body." Not because suffering is virtuous, but because it's revelatory. It shows you what you actually believe, not what you think you should believe. It reveals whether your values are decorative or structural, whether your identity is a costume or a skeleton. The cost of not knowing yourself shows up everywhere. In relationships, you attract people who love your mask, not your face, and you wonder why intimacy feels impossible. In work, you chase promotions and titles while a quiet voice inside keeps asking, "But what do I actually want to build?" In moments of decision, you freeze, paralyzed, because you have no inner compass, no sense of true north. You outsource your choices to experts, to trends, to what's expected, and then you resent the life those choices create. But there's a deeper cost, one that's harder to name. When you don't know yourself, you can't trust yourself. And when you can't trust yourself, you live in a state of perpetual anxiety. Every decision becomes agonizing. Every path feels uncertain. You second-guess, you ruminate, you seek reassurance from others because you have no internal authority to consult. You become, in the words of Marcus Aurelius, a vagrant, an exile, one who moves about without purpose. Here's another reversal. Self-knowledge is not about discovering some fixed, essential core. It's not about finding your true self, as if it were a treasure buried inside you. The Stoics understood that the self is not a noun. It's a verb. It's something you practice, something you build through attention and action. You don't find yourself. You create yourself through the conscious, repeated choice to live according to principles you've examined and embraced as your own. This is why Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself, in his meditations, of his core principles. Not because he was forgetful, but because he understood that the self is not automatic. It requires daily renewal, constant vigilance. In a world full of voices telling you who to be, self-knowledge is an act of rebellion. It's choosing to listen to the one voice that matters, your own, clarified by reason, guided by wisdom, tested by experience. Think about the last time you made a decision that felt truly yours. Not reactive, not compulsive, not performed for an audience. A decision that came from a place of clarity about who you are and what you value. How did it feel? Likely, it felt like freedom. Not because the decision was easy, but because it was authentic. And authenticity, even when it's difficult, is always more liberating than the alternative. Now, before we go deeper, I want to invite you into this community of reflective thinkers. If this resonates with you, if you're tired of surface-level wisdom and hungry for ideas that actually matter, subscribe to this channel. And leave a comment below, not with agreement, but with your own hard truth. What's one way you've been living someone else's life without realizing it? Let's build a space where real thought happens, where we challenge each other to go deeper. That's what philosophy was always meant to be. Not a lecture, but a conversation. The question, then, is not whether you know yourself, but whether you're willing to do the work required to know yourself. And let's be clear, it is work. It's uncomfortable, sometimes painful, often lonely. It requires you to sit with questions that have no easy answers. It demands that you examine beliefs you've held your entire life and ask, is this actually true, or did I just inherit it? It means confronting the gap between who you are and who you pretend to be, and choosing slowly, patiently to close that gap. Epictetus taught his students to ask, constantly, is this something within my control? But beneath that question is a deeper one. Do I even know what I actually want to control? Because if you don't know yourself, you'll spend your energy controlling things that don't matter, managing appearances, protecting an identity that isn't even real, fighting battles that were never yours to fight. Here's a practical exercise rooted in Stoic practice. Tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself 3 questions. First, what did I do today that felt truly mine? Not performed, not obligatory, but authentic. Second, what did I do today that betrayed who I want to be? Be specific. Be honest. Third, what one thing can I do tomorrow to close the gap between who I am and who I'm capable of becoming? Write it down. Not in your phone, but by hand. There's something about the physical act of writing that makes the commitment real. This is the practice of self-knowledge. Not a single revelation, but a daily discipline. Not a destination, but a direction. And the beautiful thing? The more you know yourself, the less you need. You stop chasing validation because you have internal approval. You stop fearing judgment because you've already judged yourself with honesty and compassion. You stop comparing because you're finally living your own standard, not someone else's. But let's go deeper still, because there's a paradox here that the Stoics understood and we often miss. The more you know yourself, the more you realize how little the self actually matters. This sounds contradictory, but stay with me. When you truly understand your own mind, your patterns, your conditioning, you start to see that much of what you call yourself is just noise. It's the accumulated static of memory, culture, biology, habit. And beneath that noise, there's something quieter, something steadier. The Stoics called it the rational faculty, the governing principle, the inner citadel. It's the part of you that observes, that chooses, that can step back from the chaos and respond with wisdom. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But that power is only accessible if you know your own mind well enough to distinguish between reaction and response, between impulse and intention, between fear and wisdom. Most people, most of the time, are not living. They're being lived by unexamined patterns, unconscious scripts, autopilot settings installed years ago and never updated. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Not knowing yourself doesn't just limit you. It makes you dangerous. To yourself first, but also to others. Think about it. How much harm has been done by people who lacked self-awareness? The boss who projects his insecurities onto his team. The parent who inflicts on her child the wounds she never healed. The partner who sabotages love because he doesn't understand his own attachment patterns. The activist who fights for justice in the world while treating the people around him with cruelty. Ignorance of the self is not benign. It radiates outward, creating suffering in concentric circles. Seneca observed, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality." But why? Because we don't know ourselves well enough to distinguish between real threats and phantom ones. We don't understand the architecture of our own fear, so we let it govern us. We make decisions to avoid pain we've invented, sacrifice opportunities to escape risks that never existed, and build walls around hearts that were never in danger. Consider the modern epidemic of anxiety. Yes, there are biological factors, environmental stressors, legitimate challenges. But beneath much of it lies a fundamental disconnection from the self. When you don't know who you are, everything feels threatening because you have no stable ground to stand on. Every opinion becomes an attack. Every change feels like a crisis. Every decision carries existential weight because there's no clarity about what actually matters to you. You're anxious not because life is overwhelming, but because you're trying to protect an identity you don't understand, maintain standards you never chose, and meet expectations you never agreed to. The Stoic solution is radical in its simplicity. Reduce yourself to what's essential. Strip away the roles, the titles, the stories, the performances, and ask, what remains? Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly. Emperor, father, husband, all of that was circumstantial. Beneath it, he was a human being with a rational mind, capable of thought, choice, and virtue. That was the core. Everything else was external, changeable, ultimately out of his control. And paradoxically, by releasing his grip on the external, he found freedom and power in the only place it actually exists, within. But here's the modern challenge. We live in a culture that profits from your self-ignorance. The advertising industry exists to make you feel incomplete so you'll buy completion. Social media is designed to keep you comparing, performing, seeking validation from an audience that doesn't actually know you. The news cycle thrives on fear, keeping you reactive and distracted. The productivity complex tells you that your worth is your output, your value is your efficiency, your identity is your achievement. All of it depends on you not pausing long enough to ask, is this actually true for me? The cost of not knowing yourself, then, is that you become controllable. When you don't know what you value, advertisers will sell you values. When you don't know what you need, Influencers will tell you what to want. When you don't know your purpose, the culture will assign you one. Consume, perform, compete, repeat. You become a market, not a person. A demographic, not an individual. A user, not a soul. This is why the Stoics insisted on the daily practice of philosophy. Not philosophy as an academic subject, but as a way of life, a discipline of attention. Every morning, Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of his principles. Every evening, Seneca reviewed his day, asking what he did well and where he fell short. Not to flagellate himself, but to learn, to refine, to become more conscious. They understood that the default setting is unconsciousness, distraction, drift. Self-knowledge requires intentionality. Let me give you a contemporary example. Imagine a successful professional, mid-30s, impressive resume, respected by peers. From the outside, thriving. But inside, a growing emptiness. He works 70-hour weeks, not because he loves the work, but because stopping would mean facing the question he's been avoiding. What do I actually care about? His identity is entirely external, built on performance and validation. And one day, burnout hits, not gradually but suddenly, like a system collapse. And in the forced stillness of breakdown, he finally meets himself. And the person he meets is a stranger. This is the crisis that self-knowledge prevents. Not by making life easier, but by making it conscious. When you know yourself, you can design a life that fits who you are, not who you think you should be. You can set boundaries without guilt because you understand your limits. You can pursue goals that actually matter to you, not just goals that look good. You can say no to opportunities that would take you off course, and yes to challenges that would help you grow. You become the author of your life, not just a character in someone else's story. But the journey inward is not all light and liberation. Sometimes what you discover about yourself is hard to accept. Maybe you're not as kind as you thought. Maybe your motives aren't as pure as you believed. Maybe you've been lying to yourself about something fundamental. The Stoics called this seeing things as they are, and they knew it could be brutal. But they also knew that truth, however uncomfortable, is always better than illusion. Because you can't change what you won't acknowledge. You can't grow beyond patterns you refuse to see. Epictetus taught that we have two essential faculties: perception and will. Perception allows us to see reality clearly, without distortion. Will allows us to choose our response. But both depend on self-knowledge. If you don't understand your biases, your perception will be clouded. If you don't know your values, your will has no direction. Self-knowledge is the foundation of everything else. Without it, you're building on sand. Here's another shift. Self-knowledge is not selfish. In fact, it's the opposite. When you know yourself deeply, you stop projecting onto others. You stop expecting people to complete you, validate you, save you. You take responsibility for your own wholeness. And from that place of internal stability, you can actually show up for others without resentment, without neediness, without the constant transactional calculating of who owes whom. You can love from fullness, not lack. You can give from abundance, not obligation. Think of the people you most admire, the ones who seem grounded, clear, at peace. They're not perfect. They're not without struggle. But they have something rare, a coherent sense of self. They know who they are, what they stand for, what they will and won't tolerate. And that clarity creates a kind of calm authority that doesn't need to prove itself. They don't argue for their worth because they know it. They don't chase approval because they have their own. This is the fruit of self-knowledge. Not arrogance, but quiet confidence. Not rigidity, but flexible strength. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. But the quality of your thoughts depends on whether you're actually thinking them, or whether they're thinking you. Are you directing your mind, or is your mind running old programs on autopilot? Are you choosing your responses, or are you being chosen by conditioning you never questioned?" Self-knowledge is the difference between living and being lived. So what does the practice actually look like day to day? It's simpler than you think, but it requires consistency. First, create space for solitude. Not loneliness, but intentional aloneness. Time without distraction, without input, without performance. Just you and your thoughts. Walk without your phone. Sit in silence for 10 minutes. Journal without agenda. The goal is not to achieve anything, but to listen, to notice, to become familiar with the landscape of your own mind. Second, question everything you take for granted. Why do you want what you want? Why do you fear what you fear? Where did that belief come from? Is it still serving you? The unexamined assumption is a tyrant. It rules you without your consent. But when you examine it, hold it up to the light, test it against your actual experience, you often find it's hollow. And in that discovery, you find freedom. Third, pay attention to your body. The Stoics were rationalists, but they understood that the body holds wisdom the mind often misses. Your tension, your fatigue, your restlessness, these are signals. Not problems to fix, but information to interpret. When you feel resistance, ask why. When you feel drawn to something, investigate what that's about. Your body often knows what your mind is still denying. Fourth, align your actions with your values. Not someday, not when things settle down, but now. Start small. If you value honesty, tell one more truth today than you did yesterday. If you value courage, take one small risk. If you value compassion, extend it once to someone who doesn't deserve it. The gap between who you are and who you want to be closes one action at a time. Self-knowledge without action is just interesting information. It's the doing that transforms you. And finally, accept that this work is never finished. You will never fully know yourself because you're not a static object, you're a dynamic process. You're changing, evolving, responding to new challenges and contexts. The Stoics understood this. They didn't seek to know themselves once and for all. They sought to remain in conscious relationship with themselves, constantly observing, adjusting, refining. The goal is not arrival. The goal is attention. The cost of not knowing yourself is that you spend your entire life as a stranger in your own skin, chasing things you don't want, fearing things that aren't real, performing for an audience that doesn't matter, and wondering why success feels like failure and connection feels like loneliness. But the gift of self-knowledge is that you get to wake up, to step out of the script, to stop being a reaction and become a response, to find, in the words of Marcus Aurelius, that quiet, untroubled retreat within your own soul. And when you find that place, something shifts. The world doesn't get easier, but you get stronger. Circumstances don't change, but your relationship to them does. You stop needing life to be different before you can be at peace. You stop waiting for permission to become who you already are. You realize that the freedom you've been seeking was never out there. It was always here, waiting for you to claim it through the simple, difficult, essential work of knowing yourself. So the question is not whether this matters. The question is whether you're willing to begin. Not tomorrow, not when things calm down, but now, in this moment, with one simple act of attention, one honest question, one step toward the person you're capable of becoming. Because the life you're meant to live is not out there, waiting to be found. It's in here, waiting to be built. And it starts with knowing who's doing the building. You are not your job, your achievements, your relationships, your past, your mistakes, your reputation, or your potential. You are the awareness that observes all of that. And when you learn to rest in that awareness, when you know yourself not as a collection of stories but as the spacious presence in which all stories arise and fall, you find something the Stoics promised and the world cannot give you. An unshakable peace that does not depend on anything outside yourself. That is the promise. That is the practice. That is the path. And it begins the moment you decide that knowing yourself is not optional, not someday, but the most important work you will ever do.